In the annals of medieval warfare, siegecraft was as crucial as sword and bow. Castles and walled cities offered defenders the illusion of safety, yet under the weight of a prolonged blockade, their stone walls became coffins. And foot soldiers approached the fortified Syrian town of Ma'ara. Months of campaigning had exhausted supplies. Forage parties returned empty-handed, and local wells ran dry. When Ma'ara's walls refused to yield, desperation set in. Chronicler Radulf of Caen recorded that some saw it as divine punishment for the Crusaders' sins, greed, cruelty towards civilians during previous sieges, or failure to entrust their mission to God's protection. Others used it to inflame a hatred against the infidel population, even suggesting that Muslims had poisoned wells, forcing Christian soldiers into such extremes. Prolonged sieges became commonplace as armies vied for strategic towns. In 1346–47, King Edward III of England laid siege to Calais, while in 1418–19, Henry V besieged Rouen. In both cases, the defenders cut off from supply lines by English blockades faced mounting starvation. Regardless, Ma'ara's reputation became a moral caution. Stones on the town's walls were said to bear scorch marks from fires lit by the starving soldiers, silent witnesses to the abyss into which they had gazed. Those who had marched to liberate the Holy Sepulchre found their own flesh for sale in the bazaars of this wretched place. It reminded medieval Europe that, in war, even those claiming the banner of Christ could be driven to sin against nature itself. The tale of Ma'ara would echo in subsequent conflicts as a warning that fortifications could imprison the soul as much as the body, and that hunger could dissolve any taboo, no matter how deeply held. A besieged town could hold out for months or even years until stores ran out, wells were poisoned, and hope began to starve. In the aftermath, they ransacked stores of grain, olive oil, and livestock, yet portions remained insufficient. Starvation stalked the camp. In his Gesta Francorum, an anonymous author writes of men gnawing the hides of animals until their jaws cracked, then turning to corpses piled in the streets. Archbishop Baldric of Dole reported that the smell of roasted human flesh hung upon the blood-soaked ramparts. For common folk, the wealthy, the clergy, and even the garrison knights, daily life morphed into a desperate calculus: ration what little grain remained, scour the streets for roots and weeds, or face the unthinkable. Knights, hardened by years of battle, confessed that they could endure sword blows, but not the pangs of an empty stomach. In one gruesome anecdote, a Frankish knight in brigandine armor is said to have offered his own arm to a comrade too weak to rise from the ground. In the autumn of 1098, during the First Crusade, a weary army of Western knights. According to multiple eyewitnesses, the Crusaders took Ma'ara by storm. These accounts describe how leaders at first punished stray acts of butchery ordering courts, martial for those caught digging graves, but as deaths from hunger mounted, the prohibitions collapsed. Although medieval chroniclers agreed on the occurrence of cannibalism at Ma'ara, they interpreted it differently. In the centuries that followed, Ma'ara entered legend as the ultimate siege horror. 2 centuries after Ma'ara, the stakes in Western Europe grew higher during the 100 Years' War between England and France. During the 11-month siege of Calais, civic records report that the city's population, swollen by refugees fleeing nearby battles, dwindled from 20,000 to fewer than 6,000. Contemporary French poet Jean Froissart describes children weeping and clutching their empty bellies, and families resorting to foraging for roots and bark. Rumor swirled that early in 1347, small groups of desperate citizens were discovered wrestling over the bodies of the newly dead. Although no chronicler directly describes cannibal feasts, later retellings spoke of children nibbled at abandoned corpses, and the magistrates issued decrees forbidding the mutilation of bodies under penalty of death and indirect acknowledgement of taboo breach. At Rouen, Henry V's siege loomed over Normandy's capital for 6 agonizing months. Monastic chronicles from nearby abbeys note recurring prayers for deliverance, yet mention the stench of famine rising from inside the walls. Civic leaders feared contagion from decomposing bodies but feared unrest even more, so they tolerated limited breaches of the dead. Eating human flesh violated both natural law and divine command. Thou shalt not feed upon thy neighbor, preached priests from Paris to Piacenza. After Mera, Pope Urban II was said to have issued proclamations forbidding any Christian soldier from tasting human meat. If violated, the offender would forfeit absolution even if compelled by hunger. Other canonists debated whether hunger could mitigate guilt. Did a man who ate out of necessary survival carry the same sin as one who cannibalized for sport? In Rouen, a medieval play performed during the siege depicted devils leading famished citizens into scenes of grotesque feasting on human limbs, urging the audience to repent before succumbing to sin. Canon lawyers drafted special dispensations, allowing priests to bury unshriven dead or to grant absolution without full confession for those who had violated cannibal taboos under duress. These dramatizations reinforced that hunger, though physiological, had spiritual ramifications. To feed the body by devouring another's flesh was to devour one's own soul. Most agreed that the sacrament of penance could restore the sinner, but the penance required was severe pilgrimages, fasting, and public flagellation. When instances of cannibalism surfaced, ecclesiastical writers unleashed a torrent of condemnation, conflating such acts with heresy, witchcraft, and satanic ritual. In Italy, the Visconti rulers of Milan depicted submitted city-states in frescoes, each tableau marked by giant figures consuming smaller ones, a moral allegory of tyranny and hunger's extremes. After Calais fell to the English in August 1347, survivors told tales of skeletal figures, stumbling from the gates, hollows in their clothing where flesh once had been, and of widows who would rather die than beg for bread. Local ordinances allowed limited slaughter of horses, the only remaining food source, but suspended all penalties for corpse looting. When a city's walls became its prison, citizens discovered that a civilized veneer Christian charity, canon law, civic duty could erode faster than the town's masonry under relentless hunger. One account tells of a starving baker who, after failing to find grain, baked a loaf from dried peas mixed with clay, only to collapse and die before he could test it. Suspicion fell upon him for a brief moment of madness in his last hours. Although direct evidence of widespread cannibalism at Calais and Rouen remains scant, the rescinding of corpse protection laws and the sharp increase in mortalities from starvation and disease suggest that social taboos stretched and sometimes snapped. These northern sieges demonstrate that the specter of cannibalism haunted medieval Europe not only in the Levant, but on its own soil. Cannibalism struck at the heart of medieval moral and religious sensibilities. Thomas of Cantimper, a 13th-century theologian, labeled cannibals the vilest of beasts, deserving excommunication and eternal damnation. Urban legends amplified the horror. Stories circulated of spectral figures rising from mass graves to haunt the living curses placed on towns that sank to cannibalism. Clergy in besieged cities sometimes participated in the panic. Despite the harsh rhetoric, clergy also organized relief efforts, alms, collections, distribution of grain, and appeals to neighboring towns for aid. In this dual response, condemnation paired with conditional mercy, the medieval Church grappled with the tension between upholding moral order and recognizing the extremity of human suffering. Theological debates on cannibalism during sieges reveal how medieval society tried to contain the uncontainable, hunger. By framing cannibalism as both the gravest sin and a pitiable weakness, medieval thinkers sought to warn against moral collapse while offering pathways to redemption for those pushed beyond the brink. They carried not only the scars of hunger, but memories of taboos broken in blood. Chroniclers recorded these survivors' accounts, some with shame, others with defiance, ensuring that future generations would view siege cannibalism as the ultimate symbol of desperation and sin. When the walls of a besieged city finally fell by force, starvation, or negotiation, the survivors emerged into a changed world. Archaeological excavations in medieval fortress towns have uncovered mass graves with unusual cut marks on bones, evidence of flesh removal and defleshing. Lessons from Rouen, Calais, and Rouen influenced both military and civic leaders. Supply lines became as vital as fortifications, and the cruelty of blockade became recognized as a weapon that wounded moral as well as mortal flesh. These grim finds corroborate the textual sources and remind us that cannibalism was rarely imagined. It was enacted under the most harrowing circumstances, They remind us that when civilization's appetites are denied, the primal instinct to survive can overwhelm deeply held taboos. Yet, in the ashes of these tragedies, medieval society also found seeds of compassion, new institutions of charity, legal reforms, and communal bonds forged in adversity. In remembering these dark chapters, we confront the shadows within ourselves and affirm that the measure of humanity lies not only in the walls we build, but in how we care for one another when the walls fail. In Mara, excavators found butcher marks on human femurs identical to those on animal remains, from the same level, a silent testimony to the collapse of order. The literary legacy of siege cannibalism extended into medieval romance and drama. In the 14th century French poem Renaud de Montauban, the hero refuses to eat a captive soldier's flesh, declaring that no hunger worse than Hydra's teeth may force a Christian to sin so gravely. Such scenes served as moral exemplars, reinforcing the sanctity of human life even amid war's savagery. In civic regulations, many towns codified policies to prevent future tragedies, stockpiling grain in underground vaults, maintaining secret aqueducts, or constructing relief gates for humanitarian corridors. Some cities established grain churches, where surplus grain from harvests was stored and dispensed during emergencies, an early form of social insurance born directly from the memory of famine and its horrors. By the late Middle Ages, siege warfare had evolved with gunpowder, artillery, and new tactics, but the specter of starvation remained. Ultimately, the stories of cannibalism and hunger in medieval sieges teach us about the extremities of human endurance and the fragility of social bonds. They remind us that when civilization's appetites are denied, the primal instinct to survive can overwhelm deeply held taboos. Yet, in the ashes of these tragedies, medieval society also found seeds of compassion, new institutions of charity, legal reforms, and communal bonds forged in adversity. In remembering these dark chapters, we confront the shadows within ourselves and affirm that the measure of humanity lies not only in the walls we build, but in how we care for one another when the walls fail.